I watched the woman punch in the numbers with the confidence of someone who owned the place. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Standing at the keypad of my private security gate in broad daylight, she grinned over her shoulder and said to the two kids behind her, "Don't worry, Karen said, it's totally fine." The gate slid open with a familiar beep, and just like that 3 strangers walked onto my land like it was some public park. I wasn't home but my cameras were, and as I sat there in a cafe across town watching the live footage on my phone, I nearly dropped my latte. That gate wasn't just a fancy entrance, it was my personal line of defense from HOA insanity. And somehow the village queen herself had handed out the code like Halloween candy. I didn't know her well, but in that moment I knew one thing for sure: Karen had declared war, and I wasn't going down quietly. The whole point of building the gate was peace. Quiet. I'm a game developer. I like solitude, controlled chaos on a screen, not chaos outside my front porch. So when I moved into this suburban, HOA-run neighborhood last year, I did my due diligence. I got permits, paid extra to upgrade the security system, installed motion-triggered lights, laser sensors, even a voice-controlled speaker that could play anything from Beethoven to barking dogs. Not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned the hard way in my last neighborhood what happens when people ignore boundaries. What I didn't expect was for those boundaries to be actively sabotaged from the inside by a neighbor who thought the street was her kingdom. Karen was the kind of person who wore tennis visors indoors and introduced herself using the full phrase, "I am the face of this HOA." She wasn't elected. Nobody remembered voting. But she showed up at every doorstep with welcome baskets and lists of rules she printed herself. The first time I met her was the day I moved in. She marched right up to my porch and said, "You must be Jason." I said, "It's Jackson." She said, "Close enough." Then, without asking, she handed me a packet of neighborhood bylaws she had annotated in red ink. I thanked her politely and never opened it. That should have been my first warning. At first things were fine. Karen didn't bother me and I didn't give her a reason to. I kept my lawn trimmed. I didn't host loud parties. I even fixed the flickering community lamp post when nobody else would. But then came the tiny infractions. A note in my mailbox saying too many weeds in the flower bed. A warning taped to my trash can about proper lid orientation. And finally the passive-aggressive comment during a casual wave where she said it's nice to have quiet neighbors who know their place. I should have responded then, but I let it go. That was my second mistake. The real turning point happened 3 weeks before the gate incident. I just finished upgrading the access system with a randomized digital code and backup mobile app. I only gave the code to the local fire department, police, and my delivery service. Not even my own brother had it. But suddenly people were showing up unannounced. One woman in yoga pants wandered into my backyard thinking it was a shortcut to the tennis courts. A teenager knocked on my garage asking if this was where the pool party was. And a DoorDash guy tried to hand me someone else's Chinese food. When I asked how they got in, every single one of them said Karen. I confronted her the first time it happened. She was standing in her front yard rearranging potted plants in color order. I walked up and said, "Hey Karen, did you give out my gate code?" She blinked like she'd forgotten who I was. "Oh, that thing," she said dismissively. "People just asked and I figured it was fine. We're all neighbors, right?" I told her that code was private. She shrugged and said, "It's not like it's your bank password." I was stunned. Not just at her audacity, but at the sheer confidence in her voice, like she truly believed she had the authority to override my privacy. I told her not to do it again. She gave me a sarcastic promise and turned back to her begonias. After that I changed the code, reprogrammed the keypad, updated the backup server. I thought that would be the end of it, but clearly I underestimated her determination. Watching those 3 strangers walk in through the gate that morning proved one thing: Karen wasn't just ignoring my request, she was actively working around it. And if she wanted to make this personal, then so be it. I didn't scream. I didn't march over and bang on her door like she probably would have done. I did something worse. I started thinking. See, revenge is tricky when you're dealing with a narcissist. They never believe they're wrong. But they can't stand public embarrassment. And if Karen wanted to be the neighborhood concierge, then I'd give her the role officially. All I needed was a little creativity and the right set of digits. I went through old emails, pulled up the digital version of the neighborhood roster Karen had sent out herself as a welcome pack. It included contact numbers for emergency HOA assistance, which of course meant her personal cell. I saved the number, then opened my gate system and changed the code to match her 10-digit number. It was beautiful. No one would suspect it unless they knew her, and those who did know her wouldn't dare abuse it again. Then I printed a sign. Not angry, not accusatory. Just polite and vague enough to be HOA friendly. Notice gate code has been updated per neighborhood courtesy. For access, please contact Karen, HOA liaison. I laminated it, zip-tied it to the keypad, then sat back and waited. The fallout started within an hour. First, a confused delivery guy called Karen asking for access. Then a neighbor's visiting aunt texted her at 6 a.m. By noon she had over 40 missed calls and 5 angry voicemails from people asking why they couldn't get in. Her phone was blowing up, and I was sipping coffee on my porch, watching it unfold like a sitcom marathon. She stormed outside mid-afternoon red-faced and yelling into her phone while pacing in high heels on her lawn. She shouted something about being harassed and needing a code change immediately. I smiled, because now she knew what it felt like. The best part was I hadn't broken a single rule. The code was secure. No one was being denied entry, they just had to go through the very person who made it a free-for-all. I hadn't cursed her name or called her out directly. I let her drown in the very chaos she created. And for the first time since I moved in, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to take a hit and retreat. No. She was planning something. And while I enjoyed the silence that afternoon, I also knew the real game was just beginning. Because when a gate becomes a battlefield and a keypad turns into a weapon, the war isn't over until someone loses their crown. And Karen didn't like losing anything. The next morning began with a knock that sounded more like an insult than a greeting. I opened the door to see Karen standing there, her jaw tight and her phone clenched like a courtroom exhibit. Her fake smile was back, the kind people wear before delivering a threat disguised as a compliment. She started with a syrupy tone that didn't match the fire in her eyes. "I brought you some cupcakes," she said, holding out a tray like it was a peace treaty baked in vanilla frosting. They were poorly frosted, half-tilted, and clearly store-bought. I took one just to be polite, but didn't move from the doorway. She launched into a long, winding tale about how misunderstood she was, how people in the neighborhood depended on her for access, how she was just trying to keep things friendly. The word friendly sounded more like a curse coming from her lips. She danced around the topic for a while, until finally she blurted, "So you're really not going to change it back?" I replied calmly, "Why would I? You're the one who gave the code to half the town." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Her brain was probably buffering between excuse and tantrum. She finally hissed, "You made me look like an idiot." I nodded, not even pretending to disagree. She turned around with a dramatic huff and stormed back toward her house, heels stabbing the lawn like daggers. I knew that wasn't the end of it. Karen never stopped at losing gracefully. She'd retreat to regroup, probably pace her kitchen for hours plotting her next move like a Bond villain with a PDA membership. And sure enough, the sabotage began within days. First, I found a neon orange warning note taped to my gate. It looked official until I noticed the grammar mistakes and the fact that it was printed on printer paper instead of HOA stationery. It warned me of non-compliance with a fictional gate visibility ordinance, citing rules that didn't exist. I left it up just long enough to scan and email it to the Real HOA board, adding the subject line, "For your entertainment." Then came the fake complaints. I received a city citation notice in the mail about operating a home business without proper zoning. Apparently someone had called in a tip that I was running a commercial enterprise out of my garage. Which, in a way, was true. I was a game developer working remotely, but that's about as disruptive as a librarian in a padded room. Still, a zoning officer showed up. To his credit, he was polite. He took one look at my setup, 2 monitors, some action figures, and a mini-fridge, and laughed. "I'm sorry, man," he said. "We've been getting a lot of these calls lately. Same handwriting on the forms. Let me guess, Karen?" After he left, I checked my security footage again. It was now a daily habit. Cameras showed Karen walking past my driveway twice a day, sometimes lingering by the gate as if inspecting it. Once, she brought a child with her and appeared to be explaining how to bypass the keypad. She actually pointed at the box and tried to pry it open with her nails while the kid stood there looking bored. What she didn't know was that I had installed a new function in the system, a tamper alert. When anyone tried to open the keypad housing, the system flashed a warning on the screen and instantly saved a photo to my cloud server. A message blinked on the keypad after her second attempt. Tampering detected. Footage forwarded to HOA Legal. Karen's face when she saw that could have won an award. She looked up directly at the camera, eyes wide, and for once in her life didn't say a word. Just spun around and speed-walked back to her house like she was trying to outrun her own shame. The next morning, she posted a furious rant on the neighborhood message board accusing an unnamed resident of cyberbullying and intimidation through technology. Her message included several veiled references to me, none of which were subtle. People started commenting underneath, asking for proof or clarification, and a few brave souls even said maybe this was all just a misunderstanding and we should leave Jackson alone. That didn't go over well with her. Karen deleted the post an hour later and put the group into restricted mode so no one else could comment freely. Classic control tactic. What Karen failed to realize was that she was losing control faster than she could tighten her grip. More neighbors started to notice her behavior. One evening, a woman named Tina from 2 doors down came over with a bottle of wine and said, "I don't mean to intrude, but you're handling this way better than most of us would." Apparently, Karen had pulled similar stunts before, changing community rules without board votes, approving fines for violations she made up, and once even trying to get someone evicted for painting their mailbox blue. I was just the first one to push back hard enough to make it public. I decided to return the favor in the most Karen-proof way possible. I installed an extra security camera on a pole near the street, one with a panoramic view. I posted a laminated sign beneath it, "Gate access monitored 24/7. Please smile." And for good measure, I set the system to send alerts to my smartwatch whenever someone lingered near the keypad. I started getting daily alerts. Each time, it was Karen or one of her curious followers trying to figure out what new trick I had installed. I didn't need to do anything else. Just let them stew in their confusion. Karen's latest attempt came in the form of a gift basket. She left it on my porch without ringing the bell. Inside were some stale cookies, a scented candle, and a handwritten note that said, "Let's not let a keypad come between neighbors." The irony nearly made me choke. I took a picture of it, sent it to a group chat that now included 6 other neighbors who had all had run-ins with her, and simply captioned it with one word: détente. They sent back laughing emojis and one of them replied, "She must be running out of ideas." But I didn't underestimate her. Karen's strength wasn't subtlety. It was volume. When she lost one battle, she threw herself into the next without missing a beat. And now that she had failed to manipulate me with charm, failed to intimidate me with threats, and failed to outsmart me with sabotage, I knew what she'd do next. She'd go big. She'd try to rally the HOA board against me. Try to paint me as the problem and use bureaucracy as her final weapon. That's when I started compiling a file. Every video clip, every fake note, every screenshot of her messages. I labeled it Karen Gate. It had timestamps, dates, and even a few side-by-side comparison shots showing the difference between her printed warnings and real HOA letters. It was a digital dossier of pettiness, and I was saving it for the right moment. Because while Karen liked to win battles in whispers and flyers, I was preparing for a full-blown HOA showdown. And when it came, I wasn't just going to be ready. I was going to be legendary. It started with a letter that looked more like an invitation than a threat. Fancy envelope, gold trim, and the HOA logo printed with unnecessary flair. Inside was a folded sheet titled, Emergency HOA Meeting, Complaint Against Resident Jackson Miller. There was no mystery about who filed it. Karen had finally escalated things to her favorite arena, the committee circus she dominated through intimidation and potluck bribery. But this time, she was facing someone who didn't flinch at bureaucracy and had a war chest of digital receipt. I didn't just read the letter, I smiled at it. Because I'd been waiting for this exact move and I already had my ammo loaded and ready. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the clubhouse, a bland building that looked like a rejected wedding venue, complete with folding chairs and coffee that tasted like regret. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed neatly and holding nothing but my laptop and a calm expression. Karen, on the other hand, walked in like a presidential candidate. She wore a bright red blazer, had a binder under her arm, and greeted each board member with rehearsed warmth. The room filled quickly, mostly with neighbors curious to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Karen loved attention. She probably imagined this would be her greatest performance. The meeting opened with the board chair, Mr. Robbins, a retired dentist who had the charisma of a soggy cracker but was at least fair-minded. Karen immediately stood and launched into a speech that lasted almost 7 uninterrupted minutes. She described me as antagonistic, antisocial, and disruptive to community harmony. She claimed I had weaponized technology against innocent residents, caused undue stress, and created an environment of surveillance and fear. It was impressive in its theatrical range, complete with emotional pauses and exaggerated victimhood. She even dabbed at her eyes at one point like she had just described a personal tragedy instead of a keypad change. I waited patiently, let her dig the hole deep enough. When she finally sat down, I stood, opened my laptop, and said one sentence before hitting play. I'd like to show you what actually happened. The first video rolled. It was the footage of 3 strangers using my private gate, quoting Karen by name. I let it play just long enough to capture the full absurdity. Then came the clip of Karen showing a child how to tamper with the keypad, followed by the sign I posted and her furious reaction to it. The room was silent except for a few shocked murmurs. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any speech. Next, I displayed side-by-side comparisons of official HOA notices and the fake warning she had taped to my gate. The fonts didn't match. The signature line was different. One even had a typo in the word compliance. I showed the zoning complaint sent to the city and how the handwriting matched Karen's notes from previous HOA flyers. I even had screenshots of her online rant and how she later deleted it after being questioned. It wasn't just a defense, it was a dismantling. When I was done, I closed the laptop slowly and looked around the room. I've never broken a single HOA rule. I've documented every interaction. I've never retaliated illegally or even spoken disrespectfully. All I did was change my gate code to protect my property. And now I'm the one on trial? It wasn't even a speech. It was just the truth laid bare. The board members looked stunned. A few neighbors clapped quietly before realizing where they were and stopping. Karen, for once, had no immediate comeback. She sat there frozen, mouth slightly open, cheeks red. She looked less like a neighborhood leader and more like someone who had just seen their own downfall projected on a screen. But then came the twist I hadn't even planned. Mr. Jennings, an older gentleman who lived 2 houses over, stood up. He was quiet and respected, rarely involved in HOA politics. But now he cleared his throat and said, "I need to say something." Everyone turned. He explained that Karen had given him the gate code personally, weeks before the incident even became public. He said she told him, "Don't worry about Jackson, He doesn't mind. He's just a bit private. He then added that she had done similar things with other residents, including letting someone's cousin host a yoga session on the greenbelt behind my property. No one else knew that until now. Karen tried to interrupt, but Jennings held up a hand and said, "Enough, Karen. We're not stupid. We just didn't want to get involved. But this has gone too far." The room shifted. People looked at her differently now. Not with annoyance, but with disappointment. It was worse. The board chair asked her directly if she had, in fact, distributed the code without permission. Karen stumbled over her words, trying to spin it as neighborly convenience, but the damage was done. The board voted unanimously to censure her for violating neighbor privacy and misusing her position. They also appointed me to a new role on a temporary subcommittee focused on gate security and digital policy. I almost laughed at the irony. Karen had dragged me in hoping for humiliation, and I walked out promoted. After the meeting, people approached me one by one to thank me. Some admitted they'd been afraid to speak out about Karen's behavior. One woman whispered that Karen once tried to fine her for drying laundry outside on a Tuesday. Another man said Karen had approved her own flowerbed extension into a community space. It was as if exposing her had broken some kind of spell. She no longer walked with the smug invincibility of someone untouchable. That night, for the first time in months, her porch light was off. No clipboard. No binoculars. Just darkness and silence. I returned home, sat on my porch, and played back the meeting footage I had secretly recorded for my own record. Not for revenge. Just to remember the moment when the tide turned. Karen hadn't just lost an argument. She'd lost her audience. Her power came from fear, from neighbors too exhausted to fight her. But once the fear cracked, the rest fell like dominoes. And yet, I knew this wasn't her final move. People like Karen don't go down quietly. She might retreat, regroup, try another angle, call the media, blame politics, accuse the HOA of bias. But it didn't matter anymore. Because her credibility was shattered. And even if she managed to stir the pot again, the neighborhood had seen what she really was. No one would forget those videos, or that moment when Mr. Jennings stood up and said enough. It was over. Or at least this battle was. The war might go on in smaller, pettier ways. But for now, peace settled over my property like a warm blanket. The gate beeped as I reset the code again. Not to her number this time, but to something even more secure. And as I sat there watching the night sky, I smiled, not because I won, but because I proved you could win without stooping to their level. You just had to outlast the chaos and let the truth shine on its own. The following week was unusually calm, which made me more suspicious than relieved. Karen had vanished from her usual spots. No morning patrols with a clipboard, no evening pacing near the gate, no new posts in the neighborhood forum where she usually treated her neighbors like peasants needing regulation. At first, I thought maybe she'd finally taken the loss and decided to back off, but deep down, I knew better. Karen didn't just give up. She waited, calculated, and then came back swinging. It was just a matter of when and how. That answer came on a Monday morning when a local news van pulled up outside the HOA clubhouse. At first, I thought they were there to cover a community event or a gardening expo. But when the reporter stepped out and Karen was already standing at the clubhouse door with a smile plastered on her face and a stack of folders under her arm, I realized exactly what this was. Karen was staging a comeback. She had brought the media in for sympathy points, and I knew I was about to be publicly thrown under the bus in her latest attempt at redemption. I stood across the street watching, sipping coffee from behind a neighbor's hedges. I didn't want to get involved yet. Karen led the reporter around the entrance, pointing at the gate keypad, gesturing dramatically like she was narrating a crime scene. The camera rolled while she explained her version of events, painting herself as a misunderstood HOA volunteer who was being targeted by a paranoid neighbor with a vendetta. She used phrases like technological bullying and privacy abuse, and even compared my security system to government surveillance. At one point, she pointed directly at my house and said he turned a friendly gate code into a weapon of mass humiliation. I nearly choked on my coffee. What Karen didn't know was that I recognized the reporter. His name was Micah, and he had been my roommate for one disastrous semester in college before he dropped out to pursue media. We hadn't talked in years, but I remembered him clearly, and more importantly, he remembered me. I texted him from an anonymous number with one line: ask her why the gate code she gave out was changed to her phone number. 3 minutes later, he paused the interview and tilted his head curiously. A viewer tip just came in. Can you confirm whether the gate code you distributed was your personal cell number? Karen blinked rapidly and looked down at her folder, clearly caught off guard. She tried to deflect, saying that she couldn't confirm the code due to privacy. Micah pressed harder, asking if she felt it was appropriate to distribute private access to others without the owner's consent. Her tone faltered. She mumbled something about community cooperation and assumed understanding. That was all the opening Micah needed. He nodded slowly, closed his notepad, and politely thanked her for her time. The camera shut off and Karen's smile collapsed the moment it did. She realized this wasn't the story she thought she was crafting. Later that night, Micah called me. He'd already put together a segment titled Neighborhood Tech Showdown, but the narrative had shifted thanks to that tip. The story focused on increasing tensions in suburban neighborhoods and how technology was being misused or misunderstood. He didn't mention my name, but he did reference the HOA resident who used smart systems to protect his property after multiple breaches. The footage showed Karen waving her arms and ranting about digital oppression. The clip went mildly viral, especially the part where she said she was being gate-kept in her own community. The comments were brutal. That same week, the HOA board received 3 new complaints against Karen. One was from a neighbor claiming she had lied about board vote. Another accused her of harassment over lawn decor. The third complaint, however, was more serious. A local disabled veteran who had moved in quietly 2 streets over reported that Karen had told him he wasn't allowed to park his adapted vehicle in his driveway because it wasn't aesthetically aligned with the neighborhood's vision. The man had recorded the conversation. The board was livid. With the momentum clearly shifting, I finally agreed to meet with the HOA board privately. I presented them with a detailed log of everything that had happened since the first incident with my gate. Every recorded tampering attempt, every fabricated warning, every passive-aggressive text she had sent to me or others. I didn't dramatize it, I just laid it out like a cleanly coded file. Organized, dated, and completely undeniable. They thanked me and said they would take it under advisement. That was when Mr. Robbins, the board chair, leaned forward and asked me if I would be willing to oversee digital infrastructure for the community, gate access, surveillance systems, and homeowner tech privacy. I told him I wasn't interested in being another Karen, but I would help draft new protocols to ensure no one else had to deal with this level of nonsense again. He smiled and said, "Good. Because we're tired of people confusing influence with authority." A notice went out the following day announcing the formation of the Neighborhood Privacy and Tech Committee. Karen's name was not mentioned anywhere. In fact, she was removed from her self-assigned role of community liaison entirely. She wasn't at the next HOA meeting. Rumors swirled. Some said she was out of town. Others claimed she was planning legal action. But I didn't care. The gate stayed quiet, the neighborhood settled, and for once there were no mysterious pizza deliveries, kids cutting through my yard, or unwanted visitors asking to use my bathroom because Karen said it was okay. One afternoon, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, staring at the new keypad installed at the community entrance, a model I had helped install that required rotating codes tied to household accounts. She knew she no longer had a master key. No one did. It was distributed evenly by system, not by self-importance. She turned around and went back inside without saying a word. But the story didn't end there. Because just when I thought the theater had closed for good, I got a letter. Not from Karen, not from the board, but from a lawyer. It was a cease and desist notice. Vague language about defamation and public humiliation. No clear charge, no specifics, just an aggressive bluff. I took one look and emailed my friend Ellie, an actual practicing attorney. She laughed and sent me back a reply with a full legal breakdown explaining why Karen didn't have a single foot to stand on, let alone a legal leg. I printed her response, folded it neatly, and walked it over to Karen's mailbox. I didn't knock. I didn't linger. I just slid it in, turned, and walked away. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, I felt like I had reached the end of a chapter that no longer needed rewrite. Karen had played every card she had: manipulation, charm, sabotage, publicity, legal scare tactics, and every time she lost ground. Not because I attacked her, but because I refused to play her game. In the end, it wasn't about a gate code or a keypad. It was about boundaries. Not just physical, but personal. Karen thought proximity gave her power. That being neighbors meant ownership of each other's space, time, and peace. She learned the hard way that respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn. And once it's gone, no code in the world can open that door again. 2 months had passed since the cease and desist letter landed with a thud in my mailbox, and the neighborhood had finally settled into something resembling normalcy. The keypad code rotation system was now routine, residents respected boundaries, and the phrase, "Karen said it's fine," had become a punchline rather than a permission slip. But just when I thought the storm had finally passed, Karen delivered her final performance, a desperate last-ditch effort to reclaim the attention she believed was hers by birthright. She wasn't subtle this time. She was theatrical, delusional, and entirely unaware that her final act would be her most humiliating. It started with flyers. Glossy ones, professionally printed. They appeared overnight taped to streetlights, tucked under windshield wipers, and even slid into people's front doors. At the top, in large cursive font, it read, "Take back our neighborhood." The rest was a rambling manifesto accusing the HOA board of corruption, me of digital tyranny, and the new security system of violating neighborly trust. She framed herself as a whistleblower, a woman wronged by the system she once upheld. At the bottom, there was a time and date for a so-called emergency community meeting she had no authority to call, hosted in her own front yard. It was laughable, and yet somehow it felt like a final test. I didn't plan to attend. I had no interest in feeding her spotlight. But fate has a strange sense of humor. The morning of her backyard rebellion, I received a knock on the door. It was Mr. Jennings again, holding one of Karen's flyers and looking absolutely exhausted. He asked me calmly, "Are you planning to show up?" I told him no. He nodded and said, "I think you should. Not for her, for the people she's still manipulating." He wasn't wrong. Despite everything, there were still a handful of residents who didn't know the full extent of what had happened. If Karen was going to rewrite history on her lawn, someone needed to bring the receipt. I arrived 15 minutes after the meeting had started. About 30 people stood or sat in lawn chairs on Karen's neatly trimmed grass. She stood at the front, speaking into a microphone plugged into a portable speaker like she was running for office. She wore a white pantsuit and had a glittery binder in her hands. When she saw me approach, she faltered for a split second, but then continued. She spoke of unity, of overreach, of neighbors being turned into enemies by overzealous tech and power-hungry individuals. She referenced me repeatedly without saying my name, but everyone knew. She painted herself as a martyr who had been silenced for caring too much. I stood quietly in the back, arms crossed, not interrupting. But then something remarkable happened. A woman from the crowd raised her hand and asked, "Didn't you give out his gate code without asking?" Karen's eyes twitched. She responded with a polished answer about communal access and assumptions of consent. Then someone else asked, "Is it true the new code was your phone number?" Karen tried to laugh it off, saying that was an unfortunate coincidence. Another voice chimed in, "How do you explain the tampering footage?" Suddenly, the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They were questioning. And Karen had no answers. Seeing the tide turn, I stepped forward, not to gloat but to finish the story she was trying to rewrite. I addressed the crowd calmly. I reminded them that every action I took was a reaction, that every measure I implemented came after repeated violations of my privacy. I explained the technology upgrades, the code changes, the committee reforms. And then I said something that I hadn't said publicly before. I didn't do all of this to win. I did it because no one else should have to fight this hard just to be left alone. There was a silence after I finished. Not awkward, just heavy. Karen stood frozen, blinking rapidly, flipping pages in her binder as if some magical rebuttal would appear. It didn't. She muttered something about legal counsel and started gathering her things. People began to drift away, a few coming up to thank me or apologize for staying silent before. One man shook my hand and said, "I wish you had been on the board years ago." I looked around and realized Karen's backyard had never looked so empty. Her power didn't collapse in a dramatic explosion. It faded, quietly, as truth outlasted the volume of her voice. She didn't show her face much after that. Rumor had it she was considering selling her house. Others claimed she was filing complaints with the regional HOA council, a group with no real power but plenty of paperwork. But none of it mattered. Her reputation was broken, not by insults, but by undeniable facts. The neighbors she once bossed around now ignored her. The new families moving in were given updated rules and real contact. No one referred to her as the face of the HOA anymore. She was just Karen again, and for her, that was the worst punishment imaginable. As for me, I finally got what I wanted when I moved in, peace. I planted new hedges, repainted my porch, and even invited a few neighbors over for a casual barbecue. The old tension was gone. Kids laughed without being told to stay off the sidewalk. Dogs barked freely without Karen taking pictures for complaint. The neighborhood had finally breathed out. I upgraded the gate one last time, not for security, but for humor. I added a small screen above the keypad. When someone approached, it played a short message: "Welcome. Access granted by respect, not entitlement." It was subtle, but everyone who had lived through the drama got the joke. One neighbor even brought me a mug that said Gatekeeper of Sanity. I laughed, but deep down, I was proud of what that title meant. And then came the final twist. One day, a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. She stood at the edge of her porch, arms crossed, watching the workers with the last sliver of control she had left. As they finished loading the final boxes, one of the movers walked up to the gate and tried to punch in a code. When it didn't work, he called out to Karen, "What's the new code again?" She looked at him, looked at the keypad, and then looked up at the camera with a face full of exhausted resignation. For a moment, she looked like she might scream. But she didn't. She turned away, walked to her car, and drove off. I never saw her again. The gate slid shut behind her, smooth and silent. And for the first time since this story began, there was no need for revenge, no need for another plan, no need to defend my space. It had been reclaimed. Not by aggression, but by holding firm, by outlasting, by proving that sometimes the best defense isn't retaliation, it's simply refusing to be pushed around. And that was the final lesson. Power isn't in the volume of your voice or how many people fear your name. It's in the integrity of your actions and how long you're willing to stand your ground without becoming what you're fighting against. That gate didn't just keep people out. It kept me in, anchored to what mattered. And when it finally closed for the last time on Karen's rule, it didn't slam. It clicked. Quiet. Final. And perfect.